Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore the psychology of entitlement. Part of the reason why I want to do this is that it seems to me that entitlement has become something of a hot topic these days, especially in the United States where I live. However, a bigger reason has to do with something that I mention fairly frequently in my videos, where I claim that, in my opinion, holism is currently the primary lesson that humanity is struggling to absorb, especially since our ability to experience life holistically directly affects the quality of our relationships with each other, with the planet, and with ourselves. And it seems to me that at this point in history, the biggest impediment to experiencing life holistically would be our excessive sense of entitlement. Basically, it seems that entitlement has become the predominant form of anti-holism in our era. So I think it's worthwhile to explore the nature of entitlement from a psychological perspective. Of course, at one level, entitlement has to do with getting what we want, and more specifically, getting what we think we deserve in life. And deserving something, in turn, has to do with a kind of indebtedness, a sense that we're owed something in one way or another. So one initial way of inquiring into the nature of entitlement would be to ask, what does the world owe us, and why? Of course, there are any number of possible answers to that question. However, I'd like to explore them in terms of two psychological constructs which also correspond to two fundamental worldviews. One of these worldviews has to do with what psychologists call an internal locus of control, and the other with an external locus of control. Let's look at these two worldviews one at a time. When we see life in terms of an internal locus of control, the main forces that determine the quality of our lives lie within us and are hence mostly under our control. Of course, the external exigencies of the world also inevitably impinge upon how we experience things, but the main variables have to do with things like our attitudes, our choices, and our own internal resources. For instance, when we see life this way, fulfilling our desires is mostly the product of things like our initiative, that is, our courage, our talents, our willingness to work hard, and our luck. From this point of view, what we're entitled to in this life is mainly a function of those sorts of factors. In essence, we're entitled to what we earn through our own efforts and abilities. So if I'm a talented athlete in a popular sport, and I have the initiative and diligence to work hard to bring my talent to its full fruition, and if I'm lucky enough not to get injured along the way, well, then I'm entitled to quite a lot. To a big salary, for instance, and lots of public adulation. On the other hand, if I have very little natural talent for anything the world wants, and if I'm unwilling to work hard to develop myself in any area, and if I'm not particularly lucky, well, then according to the logic of an internal locus of control, I'm not entitled to very much at all. I would need to man or woman or hermaphrodite up first, and then work hard to develop myself in some way that's valuable to the world. And only then could I claim to be entitled to something. Aside from resorting to outright criminality, the only alternative to that kind of hard work would be to sit back and complain about how unfair it all is, or how unfair the world in general is. But doing that doesn't actually make me entitled to anything. At least not according to the logic of an internal locus of control. That's because, according to that worldview, it's not actually the world's job to make us happy or strong or healthy or anything else. Mostly because the world doesn't actually owe us anything. Whether we're fulfilled or not in this life is mostly our own doing, which we accomplish or fail to accomplish, primarily through our own initiative, talent, hard work, and luck. And we become genuinely empowered in this life in direct proportion to the degree that we're willing to accept that reality and then to make it real in the concrete moments of our lives. The rest amounts to little more than an array of evasions and excuses, which ultimately only perpetuates our disempowerment. But, of course, it's obvious that not everyone sees life that way. So let's look at the alternative, which would be an external locus of control. According to that worldview, the main forces that determine the quality of our lives lie outside of ourselves. In how fair the world is, for instance, or in what the government happens to be doing today, or in whether we happen to like the person who's currently president, irrespective of who it is. Consequently, from the perspective of an external locus of control, life is not primarily about nurturing and actualizing our own inner capacities, but about getting the world to provide what we want. Because it's the external world that's mostly in control of the quality of our lives, not ourselves. So, from that perspective, entitlement doesn't revolve around what we earn through our own efforts and talents. Rather, we're automatically entitled whether we earn anything or not. That's because the world already owes us something just by dint of our being alive in it. Of course, there are many common ways of trying to get the world to give us what we think we deserve. We can badger and pester the world into giving it to us. For instance, we can try to shame the world into giving us what we think it owes us, perhaps by using accusatory rhetoric, or try to shame the successful and privileged people, or we can beg for it, maybe by adopting some sort of woeful victim narrative, or we can just arrogate it directly by outright theft. But, in one way or another, the worldview that derives from an external locus of control is about trying to get what we want from the world without our necessarily having to earn it. So, in a rough and approximate way, it'd be fair to say that an internal locus of control is more about an independent worldview, whereas an external locus of control is more about a dependent worldview. That is, an internal locus of control is more about seeing and cultivating strength within ourselves, whereas an external locus of control is about seeing ourselves as weak relative to external forces. However, at this point, it's probably also a good idea to note that all of this usually doesn't play out in a completely binary way in our lives. In reality, most of us probably live the bulk of our lives somewhere in the confused middle, where at some points we feel like we're independently in control of our own destinies, but at other times we're just dependently reacting to external forces as best we can. So the point here is that it's mostly a question of emphasis, whether we live our lives mostly in terms of an internal locus of control or mostly in terms of an external locus of control. And consequently, whether we see entitlement mostly in terms of what we've earned or mostly in terms of what the world owes us simply because we exist in it. Okay, at this point, let's apply all of this to a contemporary problem here in the United States: mass murder in our high schools. First, consider how monstrously entitled we would have to be underneath it all to give vent to our personal suffering by murdering other people in droves. How hideously and grotesquely entitled to the point where taking other people's lives en masse seems like something that we deserve somehow. To people of my, somewhat advanced age, all of that seems pretty bizarre, mostly because it pretty much didn't exist when we were teenagers growing up in the 1970s. Sure, there were plenty of guns around back then, just as there have always been in American culture. And certainly there was plenty of bullying and humiliation and general cruelty in high school, again, just as there's always been. But what we didn't have back in the day was the phenomenon of the fellow student turned homicidal maniac. So, why not? What has changed so drastically in such a relatively short historical span? Well, of course, any number of things have changed in the last 40 years. The ubiquity of social media and related technologies is one obvious difference. Another seems to be the higher proportion of young people who are now being prescribed powerful psychoactive drugs. But I suspect that a big part of the equation also has to do with entitlement. My sense is that the main reason we didn't shoot up the schools in the 1970s was that we just didn't feel entitled to take other people's lives. Basically, we didn't have the idea that life owed us anything remotely like that. and so we didn't feel like we deserved to be able to commit mass murder when things got difficult during adolescence. And I think that part of the reason that we didn't have a sense of entitlement that would extend to mass murder is that we were implicitly being offered a very different kind of narrative at the time. One that would help us make sense of the inevitable stress and suffering of adolescence. And that narrative went something like this. Yeah, you're going through a pretty tough period of life right now. And actually, that's true for most people during their adolescence, so you're definitely not alone in your suffering. But if you just stay the course, just keep working hard to discover and actualize your own unique potentials, and eventually become your own unique person, then, with a little luck, things will get easier with time. Yeah, it'll probably take a while, most likely years. But eventually, most of the bullies and tormentors who seem to be running the show right now will drop off into the gutter, and your time in the sun will arrive if you just stay the course and refuse to be defeated by what you're going through. In other words, the narrative for a lot of adolescents of my generation basically had to do with encouraging an internal locus of control. The idea that we are fundamentally in control of our larger destinies, even if we had to endure a lot of anguish and hardship in the short term. And that narrative was essentially a beacon of hope for a lot of us, even during the dark and dismal days of a difficult adolescence. And it helped us resist, among other things, feeling entitled to immediate gratification through, say, mass murder. And I suspect that that narrative of hope, the kind that comes along with developing an internal locus of control, is what's too often missing for a lot of today's youth. In other words, I sense that on the average, today's youth feel much more adrift, much less oriented toward the world in terms of creating a deep and compelling purpose for themselves, much less inspired by a worldview that offers them the promise that their lives will eventually become incredibly meaningful and potent, and perhaps most of all, much less convinced that there's a power hidden in their being and that they can reach it through their own initiative and efforts. So, in light of that kind of deficit, I think that's what's surprising these days is not that young people would be resorting to mass murder, but that they don't do it more often. Because, like addiction and shallow sense gratification, an enraged, entitled barbarism is one of the things that tends to take over when a meaning orientation to life is absent. But, of course, mass murder in high schools is only one modern phenomenon where rampant entitlement seems to play a significant role. I sense it's also an important factor in a lot of the chronic outrage and self-righteous virtue signaling we commonly see in the world these days, on both sides of the political spectrum. In other words, I would say that the main reason today's world seems so polarized and divided along practically any dimension you can think of is largely because of runaway pathological entitlement. For instance, think about how entitled we have to feel before it makes a perverse kind of sense to go around telling everyone else what words they're allowed to say, what values they're allowed to have, and what emotions and behaviors are the, quote, appropriate ones for any given situation. Consider how full of ourselves we have to be before we demand that the world fundamentally needs to change its ways just because we happen to be triggered and offended by X or Y or Z. Or think about how narcissistically preoccupied we have to be to insist that our own particular definition of fairness and justice should be imposed on everyone else in the world by any means necessary, as in the case of so-called American exceptionalism, for instance. The point, of course, is that while rampant entitlement is probably not the only causal factor in complex social phenomena like school shootings and overweening outrage and virtue signaling, it certainly seems to be playing a significant role. And all of that would be fine, except for the fact that it doesn't seem to be making our world any better. Quite the opposite, actually. It's not healing the various lines of fracture that separate us, and it's not making us stronger, only more insularly self-absorbed and divided. And it does this mostly by keeping our attention and energy fixated on promoting our own semi-tribal affiliations and investments, our own self-serving identity politics, rather than on building a bold and brilliant destiny for the human race. So, I suppose that at this point the question inevitably becomes, what is to be done? Of course, if we're seeing all of this from the perspective of an external locus of control, then we're pretty much stuck with trying to get someone else to do something about the problem. Like trying to influence politicians and public policy, for instance, perhaps via some form of activism. However, if we're seeing all of this from the perspective of an internal locus of control, then there's a lot we can do ourselves. And it pretty much starts with Gandhi's famous dictum that we must learn to be the change we wish to see in the world. That is, we must learn to embody, moment by moment, something beyond today's overly inflated and eternally offended sense of entitlement, which ultimately only sows the seeds of even more animosity and division in our world. In essence, each one of us can become a living beacon of hope for the people around us, a living, breathing object lesson in what real empowerment, the kind that issues from within, looks and feels like. Because I'll give you a hint, the politicians of the world aren't going to do that for us. In fact, they're not even going to make it easy for us to do it ourselves, mostly because it's not in their interest for us to start to feel like we don't need to depend on them. So, all things considered, perhaps our world would be better served if we could keep our sense of entitlement relatively lean and modest. If we could learn to live with more dignity, equanimity, and humility, and less entitled outrage and resentment. Maybe then we could really help the world grow and transcend itself by loving it exactly as it is, with all of its faults intact, rather than by trying to berate and coerce it into being something it's obviously not. After all, we human beings don't usually grow when someone's trying to browbeat and bully us into submission. We grow mostly when we're being seen, accepted, and loved for who and what we are. So, why should things be any different for the world as a whole? And perhaps most importantly, maybe we could learn to tolerate other people's disparate values and perspectives on things, most especially when we're feeling self-righteously entitled to impose our own opinions on what's appropriate on them. And who knows, perhaps if we could take all of that far enough, if we could collectively manage to extend ourselves beyond most of our overweening pathological entitlement, well, maybe, just maybe, the mass murders in our high schools might start to disappear and things could return to a state of relative sanity in that area, as well as in many other areas of our lives. Just a thought. Anyhow, thanks for watching. Peace out.